going to do a pretty quick presentation, and then we'll get to talking. So for you, if you have any questions, feel free to send them through Twitter, because we want to make sure that this is useful to what you're doing and useful to potentially the app that you're putting together. So definitely send questions, send any ideas. If you want me to talk about any particular topic, totally let me know. We can talk about anything to do with mental health care systems, the works. And so I'll give you a bit about my background and so why I talk about these things, and then we'll get moving right into the presentation. So my background, originally, my journey with mental health first started when I was doing a master's degree in digital media. So I was doing a master's degree in digital media, focusing on human-centered design. I started to do kind of like management consulting and was facilitating product innovation workshops and things like that, often with software companies or video game companies. And at the same time, I had gotten to a point where my mental health struggles had sort of exploded, and I finally realized there was something wrong, and I went to get help. And it was through that process of recovery, and I'll talk more about that later on in the presentation and sort of what I was dealing with, but it was really through that process of recovery that I started to see the same things that I was helping companies with, so to overcome challenges, to innovate, were really the same kinds of tools that helped me with my own recovery and have helped me with maintaining that recovery. So a lot of what I do now is focused on taking human-centered design, agile management tools, and sort of porting them over to the mental health sector, and particularly when it comes to personal mental health and fitness. And so since then, so I still do the business strategy, the human-centered design stuff, but just until recently, I was running a mental health kind of peer support charity, and I just recently finished with that, and now all I do is help people kind of find the tools and the skills to discover their own path to better mental health and well-being. And so that's what I do. That is why I'm here today. So I also run an online mental health community called Everybody Has a Brain. We have over 250,000 followers spread out across all of our social media channels, and what that does, so we share art and videos and personal stories to help people understand the recovery path when it comes to dealing with mental illness, but also having so many social media followers really helps us understand the types of challenges that people are running into, so through the stories they share, the questions they send all the time, and the kinds of things that resonate with people and the kind of tools that they're really looking for. So hopefully we'll share some of that today. Again, feel free to tweet anything if you like. My Twitter handle is @thepath2change. And so you can find that, on the Twitter. All right, so to get started, we're going to talk about 4 things today. So I didn't really put together a PowerPoint presentation because I'm not huge into PowerPoint. So we're going to talk about, 1, mental health. So what exactly are we talking about when it comes to mental health? 2, we're going to talk about stories. Then we're going to talk about innovation, and then have some discussion if there are any particular topics you want me to talk about. So the first thing that I really want to emphasize to anybody that's watching us, to anybody that's putting together an app for mental health, is to remember that you have mental health. And so this is the most important thing I would say to remember. When you're doing something for mental health, it's not about helping these other people who have mental illness, who are way over there, and they need us to go and help them because they can't help themselves. When you're doing something around mental health, build from your personal experience. You have mental health. Everybody has varying levels of mental health, varying levels of improvable mental health, just like you have varying levels of improvable physical health. Right? Mental illness is something that everybody can understand. You may not experience symptoms that are as severe as some other people, but I would even say that's not as important when we're starting to think about apps to help people with mental health. Because when it comes to mental health, really I suggest looking at it as very similar to physical health. And if you ever go to the gym, it's not about going to the gym, to take care of your physical health, and you go there and you talk about all the things that are wrong with you and how out of shape you are. Right? That's not going to help you take care of your physical health. The same is true with mental health. It's not about going to figure out who has the most severe symptoms. When it comes to taking care of mental health, it's about going someplace healthier. Right? So it's not about focusing on what's wrong, it's about focusing on what's strong, right? And what you can do to take care of your mental health. So right away I want to kind of shift things. So even though you may not be experiencing mental illness symptoms as severe as somebody else, that doesn't mean you can't connect with mental health, because for everybody, mental health is about where you're going. Right? And for everybody, it's difficult to improve your mental health. It doesn't matter if your symptoms are very severe or your symptoms are pretty light and easy and you're high functioning. Right? Still, for everybody, building great mental health is difficult. Okay? So that's first off. When we're talking about mental health, it's something that affects everybody. And that kind of touches on some of the big changes that need to happen and are happening when it comes to mental health. And so when we're talking about innovation in mental health, this is kind of relevant because I'm going to show you two numbers here. So the first number is 7 million. Okay? The second number is 70,000. So one of these numbers is the number of people in Canada every year who will experience mental illness, and the other number is the number of people in Canada who will have a heart attack each year. Okay? 7 million is the number of people that will experience a mental illness in Canada this year. 70,000 is the number of people who will have a heart attack in Canada this year. 70,000, much smaller than 7 million. But for most people, they are aware that they need to do things so that they're taking care of their cardiovascular health, so that they're not having a heart attack. Right? They're probably taking care of their, their physical health, they're exercising, they're eating well, they're aware that stress contributes to cardiovascular health, and so on. People tend to be much more aware of heart attacks. So, it's even something like when somebody goes out to have that really greasy meal, they're gonna have this huge hamburger and like the French fries, and like it's a hamburger with like deep fried chicken for the bun, and they're drinking back, a Coca-Cola, or like having a couple beers with that. Whatever it is, they might make the joke like, oh, here comes the heart attack, I can hear my arteries screaming. We're very aware of the things we do to contribute to a heart attack. We are far less aware of the things we do to contribute to mental illness, which is probably one of the contributing factors to why these numbers are so vastly different. Okay? 7 million people are going to experience a mental illness in Canada this year. So you'll often hear the statistic, that's 1 in 5, that's 20% of the population of Canada right there. That's a big number. So when you're tackling something to do with mental health, keep that in mind. This affects a lot of people. And again, that touches back on what I just mentioned about you have mental health. There's a very good chance that if you are not experiencing a mental illness right now, you will experience a mental illness in your lifetime. Okay? 1 in 5 is the number of people who will experience a mental illness in a given year. 49% is the number of people who will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. So you basically have a 50-50 chance of experiencing a mental illness before you die from a heart attack. Okay? So those are the numbers there, really, really important to keep in mind. Now, talking about a heart attack is something that I find really useful when it comes to looking at ways we can innovate around mental health, because innovating around mental health is, again, a really complex system. So the question that I often ask is, how do you get a heart attack? Complex question. Right? There's no easy answer to how a person gets a heart attack. It's not like there's a certain number of hamburgers that you eat before you have a heart attack. There's not a certain amount of exercise that can prevent a heart attack. Right? There's a complex mix of genetic, environmental, socioeconomic factors, and behavioral factors. Right? So the choices we make every day. All of those factors come together to affect whether or not you're going to have a heart attack in your life, and all of those factors come together to affect whether or not you're going to develop a mental illness, either this year or during your lifetime. And so when we're looking at ways to support mental health and to make changes, so through digital technology, it's at that complete system. Right? Because it's not, and we've kind of recognized this when it comes to cardiovascular disease. We know that you can't wait until you have a heart attack before we start to have that conversation about how to take care of your cardiovascular health. Unfortunately, with mental illness, we still generally wait. The focus is on, okay, like get a mental illness, start to run into problems, and then we're going to start to talk about things you can do. But at that point, you're really just trying to help the person stay alive and to cope. And it's not as easy to be healthy after you've had an illness. So we really need to shift that conversation to prevention, to supporting people in maintaining great mental health, not waiting for them to get sick and then trying to fix things, right? Because that's very difficult too. You spent your entire life being very unhealthy, then you have a heart attack, then you say, okay, now I'm going to start taking care of my health. you have a long way to work your way backwards. And the same is true with mental illness. If it's after years of lots of very unhealthy things going on, so around you in the environment, there might be a genetic predisposition, and there's those behavioral choices, and there's socioeconomic barriers, it's very difficult when things get to the extreme of illness to start to rewind all of that. So I find when it comes to talking about mental health innovation, I am very big into prevention. And that's an exciting area that there hasn't been a lot done in yet. So that is definitely something that you can look at. There's it's like green pastures for innovation, big blue ocean there, just waiting to be filled with all sorts of awesome apps that you're building. So those are some things about the mental health care system and just some ideas about mental health. Now I'm just going to run into some personal stories. And that's to give you kind of a sense of what I'm talking about with this mental health system and what's going on in the system and the real challenges that people run into right now. And so hopefully through this, you'll be able to see some different pain points and challenges where you might be able to bring some technology, to be a support, or some challenges that you'll be able to help people overcome so they're actually able to get help or start to get preventative. So I'm going to tell you two stories. So the first story is Sally's story. Sally is kind of sad. This story doesn't totally have a happy ending. Actually, it doesn't at all have a happy ending. And it really gets at some of the very common challenges you'll see in the healthcare system, specifically here in Ontario, when it comes to mental health. So Sally was referred on to me by a social worker, and a social worker who does counseling. And that social worker doing counseling had run into some challenges when she was working with Sally that I didn't totally understand until I actually got a chance to speak with Sally. But it turned out Sally was no longer speaking with the social worker because the social worker, not very experienced with OCD, even though she was doing counseling, had actually said a bunch of things to Sally that were not very wise things to say to somebody with OCD. The therapist, the counselor in this case, really didn't know that much about OCD, and now Sally wasn't leaving her house. And so actually going to see this counselor had made the OCD worse. She was now staying at home. She didn't feel she could go out. There were a whole bunch of other things she didn't feel she could do, and her OCD had really gotten to a stage where it was extremely severe. At this point, her OCD was severe enough that she was able to qualify for the provincial government to pay for her to go down to the US for an inpatient treatment program. So we have a challenge again. We don't have a lot of inpatient treatment services for people with mental health challenges in Canada. So there was a movement several years ago, which in some ways was a good thing, to get rid of lots of mental health care hospitals because they were just these institutions where people went and they were basically kind of locked up, thrown in straitjackets. It looked like something out of a bad horror movie, and that's how the system worked. They got rid of that, but there wasn't anything put in its place that would be more effective or healthier. And so what happens is a lot of people, if they're really struggling with something like OCD and they can't get help, so say they were getting help, now things have gotten worse, so they're staying at home, they're not leaving their home, there's no other place for them to go here in Ontario. And so if they get sick enough, they can get shipped down to the US. And of course there's still a long waiting line, and it's very, very expensive. They have to pay for it out of like, still there's lots of expenses involved, the travel and things like that OHIP won't cover. And usually family members will go as well, all sorts of things like that. That creates a weird and perverse incentive though, because we basically say to people, if you get sick enough, then we will get you help. So people have to actually, it's almost like a competition. You have to get really, really, really sick in order that the government will agree to go and pay for your help. So we're not at all doing something like prevention here. We're literally saying people, have a heart attack and then we'll get you help. That's very expensive and that's very damaging on people's lives. To score someone like Sally wasn't working anymore, wasn't going to school, wasn't engaging in her usual social activities because she couldn't leave the house anymore. So there's a bunch of challenges here, and that story doesn't really have a happy ending. She just ended up waiting to get help. So there's a bunch of different challenges at work in this story. So one, so there was no early or preventative treatment. The therapist issue, that's kind of common. There's not necessarily a lot of knowledge that the therapist may come to a session with. They may have never met somebody with OCD before. They may never have dealt with anybody, never have read about anybody having OCD. Even if they had some kind of instruction when they were in school, it might have been very, very brief, and it was out of a textbook. And so then when they meet somebody, and each person expresses their mental illness in slightly different ways, they may not line up with the textbook. The therapist does something that doesn't really come from the experience of knowing how to help people recover with that mental health issue, and they make things worse. So that's a very common challenge. And it's not just, it could be that a therapist may actually be not very good at their job. Therapists are just like coders, a good way to think of it. There's people with all varying levels of proficiency when it comes to coding, and that varies depending on the language too. They might be really good in one language that works for a particular type of program, right? Like they might be a really good front-end coder, but then someone comes to them and like, I have this back-end problem, can you solve it? And they're not as good with that. And the same thing happens with mental health. Therapists are trained in what they're trained in, they probably practice something, and they might be good at that something, dealing with people with particular challenges, but there's a vast array of mental health issues, and they don't always have access to the information that will actually help them help those people. So big challenge there. So other challenges that you can see in Sally's story there, not being able to leave the house. So we are seeing a lot of innovation happening in mental health related to providing therapy and providing supports remotely. And that is a really awesome thing to be seeing, because a lot of people can't get out of their house, particularly as things get more severe. And then what do? So yeah, things going mobile, really, really helpful. Other things in that story, it becomes very expensive. You'll also see in Sally's story, which is very common, it's common in the next story we're going to talk about, which is my story too, you're going to see people bounce around from therapist to therapist because people don't know who the good therapists are. People don't know who's effective. There's no Yelp for therapy. And part of the reason, here's the stigma. People don't talk openly about what they've gone through with mental health, so they don't go around reviewing therapists the way they review restaurants, where they'll talk about the meal they have. That's a big challenge, and hopefully something also that we're going to see change in the coming years. Right? And then,
hi, Mark. Sorry to interrupt. Actually, like a group that's watching, they actually have some questions about the app. Maybe you could like help them answer.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. About like counseling stuff. You want to just maybe like give them some tips or advice?
Oh, so we're thinking of creating like a virtual environment where people can immerse themselves. And then like I just want to know, is there like a common trend for a very calming environment, or like does it depend from person to person, like varying a lot?
Why do you think you want to create an environment to help people calm themselves?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, my first question there would be, yeah, why help people calm themselves?
There's common things such as like stress, anxiety, depression, etc. Like I find those relatively common between people, even just like students, yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah. So calming people is complex. So we'll talk a bit about mental illness for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So a mental illness, so one way of looking at it, is a desire not to experience emotions you don't like.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, the way I often describe this is like with a lion. So we were out on a safari, and the lion bites on you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a lion is chewing on your arm.
Okay.
You're going to experience a lot of stress and a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The result is going to be racing. You're going to be in a really bad state. You can do something at that moment to calm yourself. Somebody could jab you with some morphine to get rid of the pain. You could start chanting or listening to some music or doing something to calm yourself down, which may be useful if you're going to use that opportunity to get rid of the lion.
Mm-hmm.
But if you calm yourself down as the end destination, the lion will just eat you. And so that's something to think about when it comes to someone's running into a mental health challenge. Calming themselves as an end unto itself may not actually be useful for them, because it might actually be perpetuating the problem. Right?
Okay.
The problem to continue. So yeah, you could. So in that moment, it might be really useful to calm people, and however people want to be calm, it's fine. But looking at then helping them find out, well, why are they stressed in the first place? Because mental illness doesn't just fall from the sky. So really taking a systems perspective on it, there's always something that comes before the stress. Right? So like the lion, there's always something that happens before you experience pain. Finding out what that thing is really useful. And so that would just be something I'd throw out there. So helping people calm down can totally help them become aware of the challenge they're experiencing so they can change it. But just calming themselves down is actually shown to perpetuate the mental health issue. So it's very similar to what happens with addiction. That you experience something you don't like, you take the substance, you feel great, but then you experience withdrawal. And so then you need to do more things to make yourself feel good, and then you feel even worse, and then you have to do more things, and so it puts people on this roller coaster.
So you're saying tackling the cause of the issue is a lot more effective than just like creating a calming environment?
Yeah, and so it just be though calming environments can be useful so that we can tackle the actual cause. But if the purpose is just to calm people down, you can actually end up making people worse.
Okay.
Yeah, so just something to think about. But there's totally opportunities there to even say, hey, okay, we're going to calm you down now, but like, why do you want to get calmed down? Like, what kind of things? Like, it could be even incorporating questions. And so that's a common thing that'll happen. It might be helping people calm themselves down and actually giving them an opportunity to record what's wrong. And then people start to see patterns. Like, oh, what triggered being stressed out right now? And if they keep saying, oh, I'm always really stressed out after I have this meeting with this other person at work, well, there's probably something that needs to change in the relationship with that person at work or how they're working.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, though.
No problem. Good luck.
Yeah, I think that's about the questions. Maybe if you want to just go on for the duration, I'm probably just going to hide from broadcast again.
Sure. I'm just going to cover one other story and then talk a bit about innovation. So yeah, if anybody else has any other questions, they can just hop right in.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so the only, I was going to tell one other story. So the other story to kind of dig into some of the personal experience that happens when struggling with a mental health issue. So this will also maybe hopefully open up some other challenges you might want to tackle. So this is, let's see, so this is actually my story. And so I was diagnosed with a whole bunch of different things. Depression, OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, addiction, the works. And that's really common too. You'll often see people running into kind of a diagnosis soup. And I didn't think I had a problem. And so this is very, very common. I didn't think I had a problem. But I started to realize I might be dealing with depression and maybe some issues around addiction. So I started thinking, okay, maybe I have some problems around those things. And that's very typical. We tend to focus on the things that are bothering us the most rather than look at the big picture of what's going on in our life. And so eventually I went to a counselor, talked about depression and addiction. So the counselor sends me on to somebody who specializes in those. Very expensive, very terrible experience, did nothing. I used up all my money. I ended up going back to the counselor, told the counselor, you can't send anybody else to that therapist ever again. And then we started to talk more about what was going on in my life. And through that, the counselor started to uncover some things that she felt were a bit strange, I thought were totally normal. And it was through that we started to uncover that I was struggling with fairly severe OCD at that point. So I would do things like so for a very long time I had always had compulsions and rituals around checking the stove to make sure it was on, but at this point I would actually stand in front of the stove and just watch it. Sometimes I wouldn't leave the house because I needed to stay home and just engage in different rituals. I had compulsions, like all sorts of things throughout my life that I totally thought were normal. I was even at the point where I was becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. So I would see things and I would believe they were real. I would be standing at the crosswalk, to cross the street, and I would see, if other people were crossing, I would see the cars just running right over them and their guts and everything being spilled out over the highway. If I was holding a knife, I would see it, either cutting myself or cutting somebody else, and it would feel very real. All sorts of things like that, where my worries and my fears were very quickly becoming real. But I had reasons for them, and I just thought I had an overactive imagination. I only developed at the very end sort of one stereotypical OCD compulsion, which was the hand, what you often hear about, people compulsively washing their hands. Only at the end did that start to pop up, and I kind of knew that was related to OCD, but I also had reasons. And so at that point, I would wash my hands under very, very hot water. They had to be scalding hot, or else there were going to be germs and the works. And so luckily enough, after sort of digging into some of this with a therapist that I didn't realize was really an issue, I ended up getting into a research program. That was very, very lucky, because the research program was free. And the whole research program was built around a type of therapy called exposure and response prevention therapy. And exposure and response prevention therapy is about exposing yourself to the things that make you anxious and then not engaging in your compulsions. And so even just now, we were talking about calming yourself down. So calming yourself down is often a reason why we engage in compulsions. Somebody struggling with an anxiety disorder will experience a high amount of anxiety. They will react to that with a compulsion. It could be a substance, it could be anything, to try and make the anxiety go away. That actually is the disorder. And so getting over that is all about putting yourself in the situations where you would normally engage in compulsions and learning not to engage in them, and instead to do something that aligns with your values. So it's very, very, very difficult, and it creates a lot of anxiety. The beautiful thing about it is that it works phenomenally well, because of course if you're not engaging in the compulsions anymore, over time you get better at that, and you start to not experiencing all the symptoms that you were experiencing before. So that was really fantastic. It's funny, actually, speaking about the financial challenges that treatment runs into, the funding for the program got pulled. So very, very useful. The research program lost its funding while it was there, but I was able to keep on going on my own. And now I've been compulsion-free for about 5 years. I think now, yeah, about 5 years. And it's amazing. So all of those things I used to deal with before, I don't have to deal with now. It is phenomenal. Now, so some of the challenges in that sort of system of treatment that I experienced there, so I didn't know what the symptoms were. Really, really big problem. Right? So 7 million people every year in Canada will experience mental illness. Most of them have no idea. They think they have reasons for this. They don't know there's any other way to live. And I was the same. So looking back, I can see that I was struggling for mental illness for 12 years of full-blown OCD. My earliest memories, though, are of the fear of bad things happening. So for years, this had been there building and building, and then for years it had been full-blown. And I had absolutely no idea, and I had absolutely no idea that there was something I could do about that. So that's a really powerful change that's happening in the mental health sector, is that there's more conversation about recovery now. You can actually have conversations about how to get over these issues, and we can meet people, often through the internet, who have gotten over these issues. So that's a big thing going on in there. I also struggled with the diagnosis soup that I described there. Often people are going to be diagnosed with multiple different things depending on who they go and talk with. This is both just reality, that people have mental health. It doesn't fit into neat little boxes, but it also speaks to, again, the challenges that doctors and therapists run into. They don't necessarily know everything there is to know about a mental illness, so they're going to diagnose based on what they think. That's not necessarily what the person is dealing with, and that can have a really profound impact on getting treatment. And so I think so, and again, we saw another challenge with, you run into professionals who have varying levels of ability, and there's huge wait lists, there's lack of funding, it's very expensive, and particularly with that, though, recovery takes a lot of work at home. And there's a lot of ongoing maintenance. So I think technology, that's one of the most exciting things I see for helping people actually do the work of taking care of their mental health and overcoming mental illness, because you only see your therapist for maybe an hour a week. It's all those hours of the week where you actually have to make the healthy changes that are going to help you recover. Your therapist isn't there, but chances are your smartphone is in your pocket the entire time. So a lot of amazing things can happen with technology. And so now we'll just move into talking about those innovations. If you have any questions, jump in. I'm just going to mention a couple innovations that are going on in mental health. So the first one, I always call this group the Faster Horses group. So these are the types of innovation that aren't doing anything drastically different than what we do now, but they leverage technology to make it a bit easier. So things that would fall into this category. So I call it Faster Horses because really we're at a really amazing point in how we treat mental health, kind of like in the shift that happened when we went from riding horse-driven carts to driving our own cars. So there's some people who are still, a lot of the innovation is still focused on just making horses faster, and then there's other innovations that are really about doing things differently. So things that fall into the Faster Horses category would be things like online therapy. So it's exactly the same as the therapy that we've seen maybe for the past 20 years, but now it's using smartphones to connect people with a therapist. And so that, I still say that's great. That's great for people like Sally who can't leave their home. And that's great for so many people around North America who can't access a great therapist. Right? So when we're looking at that, the levels of different skill that we see in therapists, if you can access a therapist remotely, you have a far better chance of accessing a therapist that's effective. So really, really important innovation there, though. But at the same time, I would say there's some challenges with that, and it's still just making a horse faster because the pace of innovation in mental health research outpaces the number of therapists who are practicing those new forms of therapy. So for many mental illnesses, we actually know really, really effective ways to treat them that the research has shown us, but it takes so long to train a therapist. And so it takes time for them to get trained, which means that often the therapy being provided is actually like maybe 10 or even 20 years out of date. And then the next kind of innovation here, so just talk about peer support. So peer support is a really awesome thing. We're seeing a lot on technology as being a really innovative way to connect with other people who have overcome mental health challenges. And what we're also seeing with this shift is that it's becoming more like physical fitness. So just like with physical fitness, you don't necessarily go to a kinesiologist, right? Somebody who has an advanced degree in physical fitness in order for you to get in shape, right? Most of the time, you're working with somebody who just happens to have a very active personal practice of physical fitness. And we're seeing that shift with mental health. More and more, you're connecting with other people who have already taken the same journey you want to go on, and you're connecting with them, and they're able to help you see how to take that journey. So really, really powerful shift there. And so there we're seeing a lot of things like online forums, just people connecting through social media, through videos, things like that. So really, really effective things happening on technology there, a big shift there. And then the other bucket I would say is smartphones can be smarter therapists. Yeah. What's exciting about smartphones is that, like I said, they're always with you. And as the research becomes better around mental health, we can start to systematize it. And then we can start to look at things like, so using big data and things like that, the actual information that people need in order to make changes. And so some startups, like one startup to look at, recently got some funding from Google, a bunch of other VCs, is a startup called CareMessage. And it sends people messages, so not just for mental health, also does things like diabetes, but there's something, there's a startup where they really recognize the real work in taking care of health happens at home. And we need to connect people with just like pieces of information and things like that at the right moments so that they're not coming back to the hospital and getting worse. So that kind of idea, we're starting to see a lot of that. And now I see on Twitter here we have a question about Oculus Rift. And so, yeah, that Oculus Rift is a really, really neat piece of technology for helping people with exposure therapy. And so we know, and so this goes for things like PTSD, OCD, any kind of anxiety disorder, panic attacks, social anxiety, is that when you can use virtual reality to put people in a situation that mimics these situations that have a negative context, it might be dangerous. So a lot of the times a challenge with exposure and response prevention therapy, or other forms of therapy like acceptance and commitment therapy, is that people may feel they need to be in a situation that's kind of dangerous. Virtual reality is an awesome way to put people in that situation so they can overcome those fears and learn how to experience them in a healthy way. So in terms of Unity, let's say, I mean, Unity is real enough. So yeah, if you're doing something in Oculus Rift with Unity, I'd say go for it. There's a ton of potential there to help people have those experiences, because really at the end of the day, it's their brain that's going to be filling in all the extra spaces. So yeah, really, really something interesting to see. I look forward to seeing what you do with Oculus Rift though. And other than that, that is all of the information that I was going to give. Other than that, I'm really interested to hear what everybody's up to. If you have any questions, shoot them out on Twitter or throw them to the group that's live, and we can talk about that. So thank you for listening to that first part. Of course, if you have any questions throughout the duration of the hackathon, I'll be available through Twitter. You can shoot me a message, and we can talk over Skype or something like that. All right, thank you. So yeah, any discussion if you have, shoot it over now.
Okay, yeah. Hi, Mark. So I'm just gonna cut in for a bit and then just say thanks so much for taking the time to do this talk. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot out of it. And hopefully your advice helped the group that came and asked about that. I guess I'm just gonna start the broadcast now, unless you wanna continue on or anything else you wanna talk about.
No. If nobody had any questions, that was good. Yeah, thanks for having me.
I sent out the smartphone thing you sent me in an email before. Hopefully that gets the inspiration juices pumping too.
Okay, nice. That's
yeah,
great.
I really appreciate you volunteering. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks a lot.
Okay, take care, Mark.
Yeah.